We are episode 18 of Adrift, live in effect. I mean, for my YouTube people, probably not going to see it until it's not live. But, episode 18. I'm wearing blueberries. No, this is cool. So today we're gonna have on Alvin Pettit, and he is actually a really cool artist, sculptor, and also the director at the Bethune Center in Jersey City. So we're gonna do a nice little bio intro for him when he gets on. But what's super duper cool is we've got some news about an event that's coming up, so we'll tell you more about that a little bit later as well. And today's topic is art as protest, which I absolutely love this topic. I love it because when you think about art, when you think about being creative and creativity, it's like, I think people just want to express themselves, and I think that that's beautiful, and I think it's great, but when art has a deeper impact, that's also fantastic. I really do think that it's super cool when art has like some sort of historical relevance. And honestly, artists kind of do that sometimes without even realizing it, because obviously the work is a product of the time as it is. You're never going to have digital photography in the 1920s. You might, I don't know what the military was doing back then, but it was not as accessible as it is now. And the role of photography, the way that photography has been viewed, has also changed as a result of that. So it really changes the perspective of the work and the scope of the work. So Alvin Pettit just joined. We're going to tap him in here right quick. Can't wait to have you on, brother. Berno, welcome. All right. I feel like I'm looking a little darker light-wise today. I hope that's cool. Hope everybody can see me. But Alvin is joining shortly. Berno, what's up? How we doing, my brother? How we doing? Yep. He sees me. I was thinking it's so funny when for my YouTube people, because I'm literally talking to real people. I know it seems strange, but they're there. They're there on the live stream. Oh, head chopped off. Alvin!
Hey, how are you?
There he is. What's going on, brother?
How's it going?
How we doing?
Pretty good.
Doing awesome. You're looking a little sideways, little 3 p.m. right now.
Yeah, I'll turn away from the window.
Okay, cool.
Little backlit. All right, hold on.
No worries. Hey, yeah, B, I see you just releasing content, man. And I saw it too. That shoot that you guys just did looked awesome, man. I love the style. The absolute style. Work on that. We're gonna work on turning that around. Hey.
That better?
Yeah, can you rotate it? Like portrait mode? Yes. There we go. Perfect. All right, yeah, that's most excellent. Alvin, welcome. How you doing, my man?
How are you? Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining on. I was just telling people a little bit about our theme today, art as protest, and a little bit of background, but I have not yet read your bio, so I definitely want the folks to know exactly who you are, what you're about, what you're doing, and then we'll dive right in. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
All right. So as everybody knows, I'm just going to dive right in on this. So Alvin D. Pettit Jr. And actually, quick question. I always meant to ask you, is it Pettit or Pettit?
Pettit.
Pettit. Okay. Just want to make sure. I've been to France, so I know it's like petite when it's one T. Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
All right. So Jersey City-based artist Alvin Pettit has worked in the field of figurative sculpting and painting for over 25 years. As a child, he drew inspiration from his father, a Baltimore civil rights attorney who also pursued art as a hobby in his early years. His father's paintings reflected the mindset of the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s, which led Alvin to recognize the importance of using art as a tool for social change. After graduating from the Baltimore School for the Arts in 1988, Alvin moved to New York to attend the School of Visual Arts, earning a BFA in 1992. His professional career began in 1994 after being hired as an assistant sculptor to world-renowned artist Jeff Koons. That's awesome, amazing. Alvin continued to develop his reputation as a prolific artist by creating works for clients such as NBC, Today's Black Woman magazine, the Museum of Natural History, Macy's Parade, and Saks Fifth Avenue. In 2013, Alvin was appointed as director of the Mary McLeod Bethune Life Center in Jersey City, New Jersey. And since then, he has spearheaded the center's transformation into one of the most highly revered cultural community epicenters in the city. The center provides arts, wellness, and educational programming to all residents, all of the city's residents, and neighboring communities abroad. Alvin, welcome to Adrift.
Hi, how are you?
Quite a list you've done. It's like mind-blowing. You've done so much. It's really just like an honor to even have you on here and to be able to speak with somebody who's done so much and work with Jeff Koons, because I actually adore his work. So it's really wild that you've even worked under him.
Yeah, I was ages ago. I was hired a couple years out of college. I ended up landing a job, kind of walked in, landed it on the spot. And the project I was hired to do at the time was to sculpt a giant balloon dog. I don't know if you've ever seen it in some of the movies, or it's been around and shown in the Metropolitan Museum, the Guggenheim, all traveled around the world. But yeah, it's a giant balloon dog.
Wow.
It was in that movie, Night of the Museum. I think, I don't know if it was Adam Sandler, one of those movies. But yeah, it's a pretty well-known piece. But yeah, it was my first major sculpting project out of college. I was hired to do that, work on that. And, so kind of went from there, and, one thing led to another, and kind of been working the field ever since.
That's amazing. And you were actually, I meant to write her name down because I wanted to research a little bit more about her, but you did a bust of an activist as well recently. I believe her name was Injury? What was her name? She's one.
Yeah, that, you know what, to be honest with you, I can't even pronounce the name on that right now. I forgot how to pronounce. That's a project that's currently in the process. That's that's one of like 5 or 6 different figures that I'm working on. That's going to be displayed after there's going to be an opening ceremony over in New York, with like different figures of local heroes, people that have done extraordinary things, and just made his sacrifices, and she was one of them. So that project is still in the works.
I was just actually having a conversation with somebody about this kind of notion that some people tend to think that the work that we need to do as a society, not just as a community within the Black community, but as a society as a whole, the work that we think we have, that we've already accomplished it, that we've already reached some sort of utopia. But there's people such as those that you're working with, and they're sacrificing their time, their energy for the next generation that follows them. And we need people to be doing that, because we forget that there are so many things that still need to be done. Obviously, we're working on the Black Lives Matter movement, and we're working on feminism and trying to get equal rights for women, also transgender, and people across the LGBTQ spectrum. But there's so much work even as individuals that we have yet to do. So when I see some of the sculptures that you've been doing, the busts, I think about those people, and I think about the work that they are, the time that they're sacrificing, the time away from their families, the time away from their own personal lives and enjoyment that they're giving up for a better future.
Yes, I mean, I was lucky to meet one of them, and all their stories are different. Some of them did something heroic on the spot. Others have kind of dedicated their lives to helping others. So each one has their own unique stories. I only was fortunate to meet one who happened to be here in New York, but all the others I kind of read the bios on, and you might have seen newspaper clippings of them at some point, over the last 15 years or so. So, that's just, it's an interesting project. It's, and I'm anxious to see where it goes. I mean, but I guess basically to respond to your point, yeah, it is inspiring to meet people that you don't hear about in the news, that may or may not make CNN or, any of the major broadcasts, may or may not ever have a movie made about them, but they're out here making it happen and doing all the work behind the scenes, while obviously big names and celebrities get the credits, or if they do something heroic, you have all these people that are in our society that are really helping the wheels turn. And you realize that when you get to do a project like this, you realize how important they are to our, everyday existence. And, there's probably more of them than the ones that actually make the news. So, yes, it's inspiring.
It is inspiring. It really is insane, though, because sometimes we forget that it's even like the little work. You know, the people who might even just do like a spur of the moment, like heroic action, like you said. And I would imagine that one of the benefits to doing these sculptures is that you actually get to research the person. You know, like we're in this place. I was also just having, I have a lot of like crazy conversations, but the one I was also having happened to do with this kind of pace that we're constantly moving at, this like pace that requires us to be running on autopilot. You know, we're always going at 100%, but our mental capacity isn't really processing everything as it's happening. You know, it's almost like driving down the highway and before you know it, you're home, kind of a thing. And I feel like with the work that you're doing, you actually have to process some of that information. You have to go into the history books. You have to figure out what this person meant and what the culture and the context of their work had to do with. You know, and that's something that a lot of us don't necessarily get to do. But through your work, we're inspired to learn about these people. It's almost like you're highlighting their actions and their work.
Well, if I'm doing things that are like a monument or something that is representational of a person or a figure in history or whatever it might be, I always like to, I don't want to just make a statue. You know, I don't even like
Mm-hmm.
the name of the word statue. It just sounds kind of stagnant. It sounds kind of dead in its existence. It just sounds kind of, you know, we pass statues a million times. Sometimes we don't even pay attention to them, or we don't even pay attention to the importance of why an artist did them. And I try to always bring something to it that, you know, makes it a reason as to why this is being done as an art piece, as opposed to just copying a photograph that I saw somewhere and just getting a likeness of the person. You know, to me, that's kind of boring portrait art you'd see it down at the mall or something like that. Not to demean any other artist, but I kind of like to bring something to it, like capture something about the person, whether it's a facial expression, whether it's stance or posture that you may not normally see in one of the photographs, but it kind of captures the essence of who they were and what they did. And if I'm
Right.
making any sense with that, you know, so I'd like to make it more than just a statue or just a figure in clay or figure in bronze or whatever that might be. I like to make it something that you actually want to stop and pay attention to, whether it's just being a background, something that's just a background in on a sidewalk or a park or something like that.
Yeah. No, and I was actually just talking about that. By the way, thank you everybody for joining. We have Alvin Pettit with us, I'm sorry, Pettit with us, and you are a sculptor and artist in the Jersey City area. So, no, I was just thinking about that earlier before we tapped in, was that art, whether we mean to or not, is infused with something. You know, it's infused with a cultural context, a time context. It's infused with the kind of spirit of the person. And especially if you're doing something like sculptures, in this particular example, you're not only channeling your essence into that person's being, but you're also almost conjuring that person's being into the work. You know, you're trying to figure out that way to like, what would this person look like just right after a speech, just kind of standing there? You know, what might their eyes be doing during this pivotal moment where they just noticed something happen that was gut wrenching to their heart? You know, it's really amazing to kind of sit here and listen to this idea that you're thinking about all those little factors while making these sculptures.
Yes, the difference is why, best way to put it to you is the difference is why you want to look at a piece of art or a sculpture of somebody, and what you get out of that is different than going to a wax museum or Madame Tussauds. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so if that's the best way to put it. So when you go to a wax museum or Madame Tussauds, the whole purpose is, oh, look how much it looked like Michael Jackson. Look how much it looked like Barack Obama, whoever they may be, Sylvester Stallone, whoever's there. When you look at a piece of artwork, you want to, it should say something about the subject matter, whoever it is depicting, but it should also say something about the artist's interpretation of that subject matter. And that's the difference in art and, I would say, just a mugshot or
Mm-hmm.
just something that captures a resemblance or a likeness. I mean, you know, when I studied in school and college and everything, I took classes in like high focus realism, and where, you know, we just studied how to get something to look like a picture. And the more I did that and the better I got at actually doing it, the less interested I became in it, because it was
Mm-hmm.
almost kind of like, well, I can do it, so I can, is art just about displaying or showing off your technical skills? I mean, or is it about actually saying something that somehow the photograph cannot say? You know, and that then I began more into, I like still representational art. I'm not really considered, I wouldn't consider myself an abstract artist by far. Obviously I do figurative work and stuff, but I always like to put something in it that you can't get out of just a photograph, or you can't get by just making a cast or a mold of somebody's face. Because you can mold and make a cast of somebody and just put it up there, it looks like them. So you have to always ask, why am I making this piece? Why am I stuck in the studio for hours working on this piece if it's not going to say something more than what a photograph can tell you? So,
Yeah.
and that becomes a challenge, and that also becomes part of the fun of it as an artist and what actually keeps you in the studio. You know, as being in the studio, as us artists, and anybody who is a visual artist, a musician, or an actor, whatever arts or whatever discipline you have, you realize that there's a certain amount of honesty that you have to have with yourself, because what's going to keep you there working to 3 in the morning? You know, what's going to make you want to come back the first thing in the morning? And if you're not excited about what you do, you can't lie about that. And not only is that showing the work, but you probably just won't get it done, you know, because it just be nothing is more revealing than art or a piece of art that had no passion that went into it. So, you know, I mean, fortunate now, I'm in a position in most cases, you know, where I can choose my projects. So, you know, back when I came out of college or whatever, you know, I was freelancing, I got the art jobs I could get. But it was, even though I didn't really have a lot of control over the subject matter of what jobs that I took, what came to me more so, I think it was a good exercise, because it took me whatever, say if I was working with an art director, or if I was working with somebody that hired me to paint something or sculpt something I didn't really want to sculpt, I have to ask myself, well, what can I find in sculpting a giant apple, whatever it might be, you know, whatever what's going to make it fun for me? Where can I make this personal? Where can I make it, you know, something that keeps me interested, so I can do my best work at it? And that was it's a good challenge and a good discipline to have, because then when you get to the point where you can really pick your own projects more, where you can actually be more choosy, then you're kind of already in a mindset of how to make things interesting for you. So when you get to actually do your own work in your own style, without how I had to maybe do it maybe in the early days in the 90s and stuff, back in the 90s when I started, you become more, I guess, exhilarated in it, if I'm making sense with that.
Yeah, actually, because that's actually a perfect segue into like this idea of art as protest, because I would imagine that because your work is so specifically filled with so much of the essence of your subjects, in the case of the bus, or perhaps, you know, the apple, and whatever subjective means that holds value, like I would imagine that also really draws inspiration for you to create a piece of art that is so infused with an important context. I mean, right now, like we were talking about, we're doing Black Lives Matter, and we're finally at a place where we're so consistent with it. It doesn't feel like it's falling off. It doesn't feel like, you know, people are getting tired or whatever. It seems like the general consensus is people are really trying to push this forward and really trying to get equal rights. And, you know, we'll talk more about the mural that you did in a little bit. But what factor does protest and sort of, you know, social change in the way that your father, that's another question I want to ask. But in what way does that continue to inspire you and keep you up at like 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning?
You mean as far as the social changes and whatnot?
As far as, yeah, your work being instilled in social.
If you look at history of this country, history of other nations and stuff, some of your best art is actually inspired by turmoil. You know, it comes from, I mean, blues came out of a place of discomfort. You know, hip hop came out of a place of discomfort. Some of the greatest songs of the 60s, whether it's, or the 70s, whether it's lyrics by Bob Dylan or any of the great artists, Curtis Mayfield, Isaac Hayes. I mean, I love all that music from the 70s and stuff, and because the lyrics, you know, reflected a lot of the times and the turmoil, whether it was the Vietnam War going on, whether it was a civil rights movement that was budding at the time, all inspired some of the greatest music that we have and some of the greatest art. So
Mm.
you find now that we're getting this resurgence of some sort of movement, and we've had them before. I mean, during the times, you had the movement of the 60s and early 70s of the black, I would say, kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, you had a black civil rights movement, but you almost had a coming of age of, I guess, black self-recognition, or black pride movement.
Mm.
Even if it was talking about the afro that came to bud in the 70s, and the clothing that was worn. And I remember back in the 70s, my parents would have, whether it was zebra striped curtains or whatever it might be, or African statues that may not necessarily really been African stuff, but it was our interpretation as African Americans of what a homeland or a nation was like, an African nation was like at that time. And I grew up looking at a lot of that stuff, in the household, parents and grandparents and stuff. So all that was inspired out of the civil rights movement and wanting to instill black pride into African Americans, whereas prior to that, you had none of that. We had very little reflection in movies. We had very little, there was no black women on Cosmo. There was no Vogue, didn't show any of that. I mean, really, in the reality of it, that's all really coming about in the last few years, probably since the whole Black Lives Matter movement. Before then, you had maybe some tokens that may have gotten through, where you'd see the fashion show, Naomi Campbell and some of the great black runway models and actresses that came up, but it was very hard to get through. So movements also inspire a lot of change. So I guess to answer your question, I mean, for me, it's stuff that already I was interested in anyway, like I said, just from my upbringing and everything. And so, whenever, and going back to, not to give my age away too much, but going back to the old days, back in the early 90s, you also had somewhat of a surge of that when you had great hip hop coming out, like Eric B. and Rakim, KRS-One, all the Big Daddy Kane, and all these guys that came through that I was in college listening to, that spoke of X-Clan, that spoke of social change, that Public Enemy, so all that came about in the late 80s and early 90s, where you had this kind of movement, and then they kind of come in waves, and it kind of flattens out a little bit, and then something sparks it and resurges it. And, I'm glad to see this resurgence. So
That was what just as a side note, I'm happy that you're calling it a resurgence, because it again, very similar to feminism, because I can't help but notice the parallels between the two. You see these different waves of feminism, and each time it compounds upon itself. Same thing with Black Lives Matter. You have the first civil rights movement, you have, and then it gets bogged down a little bit, it kind of hits a flat line, and then you get another movement, and I can't tell you how excited I am, because it is a moment where it doesn't feel like it's going to flatline again. To me, I don't know, maybe I'm like just jumping the gun a little bit, but it just doesn't feel like it's going to flatline. So for me personally, very excited about that. But that was just as an aside. With the work you're doing, I think it's interesting because you also brought up a historical element to it, that you were brought up around that sort of element. And even we were talking about your dad, who was an artist in the civil rights, the Black Power movement, and inspired by that. So what was it like, would you say, like your father being such a hobbyist with art, but also being inspired by that particular era in time?
Well, I would think makes all the difference in the world. I mean, like I said, all of our art as artists is very personal to us. Some people like to paint some artists like to paint landscapes. Some artists like to paint pets and puppies or whatever gets your boat flowing, that's your thing. But it has to be something that connects with you. And I guess being with my upbringing, where I just talk of civil rights and the movement and stuff, it wasn't something that was just discussed here and there. That was kind of the reality of the household I grew up in. Even going back to my grandfather, who back in the 50s fought to liberate some of the schools in Maryland to actually get my father in an all-white school that was segregated at the time. And he had to sue the state and everything just to get my father into this, segregated school back in the 50s in high school, to get him into where they wanted to go, and it was a big trial. It was a big issue at the time, and for the stories I get, I mean, they had death threats, letters coming to the house and all that stuff, and believe it or not just from whites at the time, but sometimes blacks who didn't even want to think stirred up, as crazy as it might sound, but so I always, being close to my grandfather and hearing what he went through, and even being young enough at the time, back in the early 70s, to still see some of the things my grandfather was fighting against or suing the government for equal rights, and some of the things he was spearheading. And then my father, coming behind as far as a civil rights attorney, who he is still today in Baltimore. And so a lot of these, even with these cases, with all these police shootings and everything that's making the news nowadays, before there were cell phones, I would always hear about these cases because my dad would have these cases that, one after the other, just young black men gunned down from police shootings, or beaten up or brutalized, and they didn't have cell phones. So, they'd get an attorney, you'd hear about them. Sometimes they get settled out of court. Sometimes the city would settle, or they just get swept under the rug in some ways. But I just heard a lot about them growing up just because of my father's profession. So even the reality that's kind of made pop culture nowadays, I heard about that stuff all the time because that was just kind of the reality of, what I was exposed to. And I'm thankful for it,
Wow, fun. Just to say that you're thankful for something that hurts, that I would imagine would hurt that much and could be detrimental to your upbringing as far as like self-esteem and as far as like your psyche, like to recognize that it was in a lot of ways a blessing to know the truth that early. That's intense. That's really intense to seriously recognize that, because even now, when you talk about COVID, there's a lot of people right now who don't even see the value of what's happening with this virus. They don't recognize that, obviously, yes, and I always say this, it is a shame for the families who are dealing with deaths, but for those of us who are, and I'll say this very specifically, fortunate enough not to have to deal with that, we've been put in a position to really explore things in a new, unique, and very healthy and engaging way where we're reconnecting with ourselves. I mean, what do you do when you're stuck at home? You're with yourself. You got to deal with that and process that. So what you're saying right now is reminiscent to that for me with what's going on with COVID, because I didn't know about the shootings as much. I always felt the tensions growing up. I always felt weird in certain like white communities. Even though I grew up in a lot of them, I always knew I was different. I always knew I was weird, but I always felt those sort of whispers in the background, the conversations that I knew I wasn't ever going to be a part of, kind of thing. But I never knew about the shootings. I never knew about police brutality, because all of that stuff, I knew police didn't like me. I knew that, but I didn't know about the shootings. So again, to be aware of that so early on, and then again, to be inspired by that and inspired by people who want to make a difference by that, this isn't anything new to you. This is just like, all right, there's been work to be done. Let's go. Like, how do you guys not see it?
And then when you talk about it and relating it to art, I was fortunate in the sense, growing up, my father and my grandfather both painted as hobbies. And sometimes I, grew up seeing this one painting that my father did from the 1960s of the 1968 riots. And it shows the water being busted out of the fire hydrant, all the buildings on fire right after King was killed. And he did a painting of that. And that was just always something on the wall that I always saw that my father painted growing up. And so it not only did that help me early on, just seeing art as creating social change, but it also, just as far as the business of art, I was lucky because what I find in a lot of households, kids or young people that want to grow up and go into profession of arts, a lot of times it's discouraged because, we're almost taught to think, okay, you got to starve if you're going to be doing that as a profession, or, it's not something to go and become a doctor, lawyer, that's all you ever hear sometimes. And so those are the only two, even if you watch television shows, what do they have? Law office shows, police, or doctors. Those are like the main dramas on TV. You never see anything about artists as a nice drama. It just doesn't exist. So, and that's detrimental, I think, to the arts because it makes those of us that want to go into that as a field, you don't see it as possible. Now, that's what I'm saying. My situation might have been a little unique in that sense because my parents, my father, my grandfather did it as a hobby. It was always seen as something that, and not my father back in high school used to sell them as kind of like extra money. So it was never seen as something that, sell as paintings that is, it was never seen as something that you couldn't make a living at. So, I just always was kind of thinking at it as a profession, even early on, because art school just doesn't give you that. I mean, I'll be the first to admit, I went to some of the best art schools and had almost next to zero classes on actually how to make a living at it or to do it as a profession. It's almost, in a sense, thievery when you think of that, because you're training a lot of us. Yeah, we can come out, we can draw a little better, take better pictures or whatever, make better designers, but and especially in the fine arts. And if you don't have that background as far as how to actually apply it to real life and do it professionally, you end up doing something else. And you kind of, a lot of talented people get cast to the side because it's not promoted and it's not valued in that sense in our society. So I was lucky in that sense that in my household, it was always valued. And that made a big difference.
That's huge. I mean, especially to see a scene that kind of graphic, honestly, with the fire hoses and then the kids being hit by them. Like, it's really intense that was one of the ones that spoke to you so immensely, and that was such, again, it was a reflection of what sounds like an accurate portrayal of something that really happened. And that's the one that you gravitated towards.
Well, you got to remember when we grow up in our own environments, our own family structures, certain things may not necessarily, I can't necessarily say that I gravitated to it or anything like that, but that was just normal in the household. So what may have been normal for me, might, telling the story now, might be, rare or unique. I don't know. But for me, it was normal. So it's just things you saw every day. Talking about civil rights was just something I heard all the time. So it wasn't, when I was 18, it wasn't a choice whether I was going to vote. You just voted. It was normal. I had to. So it's kind of like, but it kind of, so I guess what I'm saying is I don't know if I ever really made a conscious choice as far as like the subject matters that I like to tackle and whatnot. It's just kind of something that I just naturally was, I guess, reared in. So, it wasn't so much, like, okay, I want to paint this, I'll paint that. It just kind of, now we're not always products of our environment. You have to still want to connect with it. So, but it was something I connected with. And I always believe, this is a quote that I read by one of my favorite artists, Picasso. And I always like to say it. And if I remember it correctly, I may be a little off, so bear with me, but art is not simply to decorate the walls of your house or your apartment. It's to be used as a tool of war against the enemy. And that was Picasso's philosophy in a lot of his work that he did, like Guernica and whatnot, and some of his other paintings, that, art is there for a purpose. Art is there to inspire change. Even if you look at some of the other, I like history a lot too, study some of the rise of Nazi Germany. One of the first things that Hitler did when he took power was go around to the different museums, because Hitler was actually an art student. I don't know if you know that or not, but he was originally—
I didn't know. It's interesting.
Adolf Hitler was originally studying art. And the way history has it written, he wasn't too successful at it, kind of got discouraged about it, so took another path, obviously. But when he did become the Fuhrer, when he took over, rose to power, one of the first things that he did was go around to different museums and take art out of the museums that might challenge, his authority or challenge his standing, because he was a former art student, he knew the power of it. And that was one of the first things that he attacked. And if you read it in the history books, it's interesting because he deems it what he's called degenerative art. And that became a term in Nazi Germany, degenerative art. And anything that spoke to rise, movement, or revolution was considered degenerative. And he had it removed, locked away somewhere. and hidden. But, you know, stories like that, it tells you how powerful what we do is. And, you know, those of us that have the ability to make imagery or make songs or make music or even make films, that's a very powerful tool for social change. Look how, in a sense, you got the kind of the tail wagging the dog nowadays when it comes to certain justices, like certain, not justices, but certain, what's the word I'm looking for? Situations like say the R. Kelly situation, or say the what happened even with Cosby. In a sense, you had the dog wagging the tail because it was documentaries of social media. You know, the R. Kelly documentary came after R. Kelly's been whatever for 30 years, and then the documentary hits. Now all of a sudden the case reopens, he gets locked up. You know, so why really it should be right or wrong. Even when you talk about police brutality, it shouldn't have to follow behind social media gearing it to make it popular and keep it in the minds before you arrest somebody that was kneeling on somebody's neck for 8 minutes. You know, that should have been just done already. But unfortunately, the world we live in is almost becoming more and more geared by imagery, geared by movies, geared by documentaries. And then the law follows. It's backwards, but it shows you the power of art and communication. And art, especially good art, and I do believe in there is good and bad art. A lot of artists may not agree with me. But good art is equal to good communication. And it doesn't have to be realistic what I do, more or figurative art. It can be abstract. It can be anything from Romeo Bearden to Jacob Lawrence to Jackson Pollock. One thing they all had in common is that they were great communicators. It's like comparing, and like if you look at, once again, blues, I'm a big blues fan, blues to classical music, 2 different disciplines, 2 different genres, 2 different training. One is probably a lot more technical training than the other, as opposed to like blues. But they both know how to communicate to an audience. They both speak to who their audience is and who their, I guess, the ears of the time were. And that's what makes, to me, good art. And if you can't communicate, when art becomes just wallpaper, like if you go to an art show and people are standing around eating cheap wine and cheese and talking to their Facebook friends and not paying attention to what's on the wall, then you didn't do your job as an artist. Because they're there to socialize. Your art was wallpaper at that point. That's, to me, you missed the point. You missed the boat.
Ooh. No, I really appreciate that, because you too often see that. I mean, like, my ex, for example, is from Philly, so like there's a huge art scene down in Philly, but that's all that really happens. It doesn't matter whether the art's good or not. People just go there to drink and socialize. And it's like, it's painful because, like, when you really look at some of those pieces, you look at some of the minor details, like you were saying earlier about your sculptures, it's not just that you're trying to represent or recreate somebody, it's that you're trying to get like a very nuanced moment of that person, a very nuanced element of that person to really convey something, you know. And what's interesting is when you look at kind of things even from the political lens and you look at the way that media portrays everything, you also see people who don't even read any deeper than what they're told. And so that kind of harkens back to what you're saying about Hitler, is that there's this whole idea that if you remove the accurate representations of people's experiences and you just isolate people's eyes to one particular perspective, that's all they're ever going to believe. That's all they're ever going to see, you know. And so that's where art, to me personally, becomes a form of protest and a vehicle for social change, because the more representation you have, the more that you get these different perspectives, these different ways to create art, these different ways to showcase art. And I also think it's fascinating because art continues to evolve as the technology continues to evolve. You know, there's this one piece that I thought was super interesting, actually in the Morristown Museum. It's just called the Morris Museum. And it's this piece that uses an Xbox Kinect, which is like the little camera on top of the Xbox. And what it does is when you walk in front of it, it creates a very sort of abstract representation of what's in front of it, which would be you. Let's say you're visiting with a significant other. So it creates this silhouette with these certain like balls that like rotate around and creates a silhouette in black and white of the people who are viewing this piece. And I thought that that was so interesting because the artist managed to create and convey a message which is actually a reflection of the people viewing the work back to them. And to me, what that piece has always said, I always found that piece to be super interesting. One, yes, because of the technological aspect, but two, because of how much credence we pay to the fidelity of the work itself. You know, that wasn't a picture perfect, exact representation of the viewer that it was reflecting back. But what I think it did is it showcased that things aren't so specific. Things aren't so easily digestible. You know, like instead of it being like, you know, Eric and Jim together looking at this piece, it was simply two people looking at a piece. It was simply two beings, two bodies. And when you remove that sort of like super personal element from our subjective experience, you start realizing that we're really all the same. We're all the same people, all the same person. And why we're having this fight in the first place is incredibly stupid and mundane. You know, it's really ridiculous, but it has to be done. And that's also part of our burden when we talk about Black Lives Matter, is that it is a burden that we have to deal with because it doesn't burden the other side, you know?
Yeah, when you look at a lot of these issues, whether it's racism or some of the topics you brought up, you know, I try to find a way to depict this in my art sometimes when I'm doing things more conceptual.
Mm.
These are horrible parts of our human nature. And the reason why I want to emphasize that is because I truly believe that what one person is capable of, we're all capable of. We don't always act out on it, but we're all capable of it. When you look at whether it's racism, sexism, classism, or any ism you want to come up with, it all goes back to tribalism. And as human beings, we are naturally tribal. So a lot of times, and when you acknowledge that, then you can kind of get to the root of the problem and how to better deal with it. You know, I'm sure I have my prejudices. You know, I think we all do. Sometimes we're not even aware of it. Probably most racists don't even know they're racist. You know, that's just
Right.
the way
Yeah.
the way they think, the way things are, the way they should be, and that's normal to them. So I guess even going back to the piece where you described, it's always interesting when you can see artwork that kind of helps break that down and gets us thinking in a different way. And I think some of the best artists, the ones that are able to do that more conceptually than just painting somebody in chains or, you know, just something that you're used to seeing. Not that that work is not useful too, because sometimes, you know, there's different art for everybody. Some people are at a level where they need to see things a little bit more literally. Other people are somewhere else. When I say level, it's lateral. It's not necessarily vertical. It's just
Love that.
in
Yeah.
just different ways, different areas we're at in our life as to what we need to see that inspires us to do differently. Now, keep in mind, even when you start talking about, I think early on in your point, you were speaking of maybe, I forgot exactly what you said, but something you said reminded me that good art, going to my last point, isn't necessarily always moral art. You know, so you can have good art with bad motives. You know,
Yeah.
art can be used for good or evil. When you go to art that you see in North Korea, or if you go to some of the communist posters of Soviet Union Russia, these are actually some beautiful prints, like the grays and the reds they use, but they're used as paintings that are really done as commercials to keep you thinking and to keep you brainwashed. So it's good art in the sense that it's doing its job, where it's almost keeping you hypnotized or brainwashed to a certain dictator or power structure. It's just not used for moral purposes. But some of the principles that they still use, even I like to study in it, because some of the propaganda art knows how to keep your eye focused in certain areas. It knows how to use certain colors that your eyes are drawn to emphasize whatever subject matter it wants you to focus on. So, you know, one thing I've always, when I used to teach class, I would teach some of the students, and one of the things that I always said, when you look at whether you feel your art is successful or it's unsuccessful, what makes us successful as artists? Yes, it's communication, but it's also how well we communicate. And it's pretty much, how do I put this? I have the words on the tip of my tongue, kind of confounded. But yes, it's basically, okay, I would say art that's successful to us individually as artists, I think is art, for me anyway, is art that can inspire an emotion or passion. So in other words, if you walk past a piece of my work and it disgusts you or you hate it, if you walk past a piece of my work and you love it and you just want to embrace it, maybe hopefully buy it, you know, whatever emotion it sparks, either one, I feel I've done my job, because you couldn't ignore it. You know, right. The only time I feel we as artists are not successful at our craft, if you've created something that people can ignore.
Which you've done. You did the Black Lives Matter mural in Jersey City, which is huge, massive. It's the size. It takes up the entire block, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah. And something like that can be seen from so far away, and even the color choice, the blacks and the yellows, like it pops. It hits with a certain intensity, and even again the size of it. You know, just because art is large doesn't necessarily make it good, but the fact that it is so large and that it is such an important message is what makes it, being large, contextually make sense and be important.
Yes, and like on that piece, basically I wanted to come up with a design that, one, I actually looked at some different, you know, Jersey City we got started a little late to the game when it came to doing the Black Lives Street Matter. So with that being said, I didn't want to just do something that was just words on a sidewalk. You know, to me that it had already been done. Once again, if I'm just reinventing the wheel, I get bored with it and just don't have any passion to do it. At the same time, I looked at different examples that were done throughout different cities in the country, and I wanted to come up with something that was very, I guess, legible and kind of could be read easy from an aerial view. So I didn't want it too busy. I didn't want it like too messy where you couldn't see the letters bold from the drone shots. And then at the same time, I wanted something that was almost kind of fun and colorful to look at from the ground, and it had kind of symbolic messages in it without it being too busy or, you know, too over the top. So I kind of sat there and worked on that design and sketched for hours, and then some things metamorphosized in the process while I was doing it, because once you actually get it on canvas, when in that case the street was the canvas, you kind of say, okay, well this works here, or you can see how it's hit by light in real time, and it makes you want to go back to the drawing board. Well, maybe I'll change this, maybe I'll change that. But overall, I did stick to the design of what I originally concepted. And basically the overall design with the stars at the end, I took, like I said, I like history, so I collect old newspaper clippings, old magazines, and like I collect old Jet magazines, old Ebony, and some of the ones that, there's some hard to find stuff. And I have one of these old newspapers from a Black Panther paper from the 1970s. So that design for the mural is actually the two stars at the end is from the original Black Panther newspaper and the way they designed it, whereas the original star had Huey P. Newton in it, or whoever, mostly had Huey in it since he was the leader when that paper came out of the Panther movement. But that was taken from the design of the Panthers. And I just changed the subject matters in them and put some other stuff around there, added the fist and everything. But that's what inspired me to do that design.
See, and again, it goes back to these little nuanced details that hold a certain value, because, you know, when you talk about like the historical value and the historical inspiration in the work, You know, when you think about that, there are certain people who may not know why that piece, why they're gravitating towards that piece. They may not really like consciously know, but subconsciously there's that sort of attraction. Like I know that. I'm familiar with that. What is that? You know, and it's almost like, I hate to word, not to say deceiving, but in a way there is this sort of element of my attention is being brought to it because there's a sort of uh, third or fourth party element that's kind of bringing me in, if you will. You know, and that's another kind of sign of good art. I was reading this book called Art and Fear. It's a really fantastic book. I don't know if you've read it before, but it talks about stealing and stealing for the purpose of making great art. And it's not, of course, that you're plagiarizing, because once you begin to create a piece, it already starts taking a life of its own because it's coming from a different source. But I love this idea of using sort of historical elements to enhance a piece, to give it more life and value, substance.
Well, with that said, that's exactly that was the intention. And there's the famous Andy Warhol, I believe it was Warhol, that said, what did this, get this quote right? Amateurs borrow, professionals steal.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
So, and then even when you look at the concept of stealing art, I mean, you know, I'm a big hip hop fan. I mean, look what, in a sense, if you want to say stealing or borrowing samples, gave in back in, you know, going back to the late 80s, and sampling came into hip hop, and throughout the 90s even to today, sampling old songs from the 70s and the 60s, they kind of brought the songs back to life and gave them new life. You weren't just copying it, you were borrowing it and being inspired by it. And really, that's all of it. All art is derivative of something that came before it. Picasso, when he started off, you know, I always like to reference him, but one of his inspirations that's maybe not talked about as much was African mask. That's what came to where he created a lot of his distortions in the face. Actually came from, you know, the roots of his cubism was based on a lot of the African mask and African art that he saw and was inspired by. Now he just brought it back to Europe, but he made it his own. And I think that's why even when I'm teaching students in school, I'm like, expose yourself. You don't become a good artist by sitting in your basement, you know, locked away at a drawing table. Yeah, you may at a drawing table or something. You may enhance your skills a little bit, but it's just like you need something to feed off of. You know, we're as artists, we're sponges, and we take what we see every day and then we regurgitate it back to something that to the public or whoever we want to communicate to. We regurgitate our reality back to you in our own vision or our own slant on it, our own twist. And when I'm in the studio, I'll be the first to say, if I'm working on one of my own pieces or something like that, this is not a democracy. You know, this is a dictatorship. You know, and that's how I roll when I'm in my studio. When I get into it, I'm not thinking about, because my thing is, okay, I got to do what I like, and hopefully somebody else like it too. Especially if I'm going to try to sell it or show it. But at the same time, I got to just be honest with myself. And sometimes if you sit there thinking about, okay, well, they like this or that's like that. Now you have to do that if you're working with a client, or you have to, you know, if somebody's paying you to do something, you got to think that way. But when you really get into your own stuff, then that's the time where you can really kind of, you know, but going back to my point, like I said, I love reading history. Growing up, if I had a bad report card or something, my father would make me go read an article out of the paper. And I had to read an article of a current event or a political topic or a social topic at the time. And then I had to make a report about it. That was like part of my punishment, you know. You know, so
Right.
again, it gives me a lot of reference to draw to feed off of, and I always related to great comedians. I mean, what would be a great comedian like a Dave Chappelle or Eddie Murphy back in the days if they didn't have all those sources that they drew from their comedy? And some comedians you even see, they lose it when they become so successful and lock themselves away from the very public that they drew from, and their comedy's not the same. You know, that's why even as artists, even whatever kind of art you do, whether it's music, writing, or spoken word or theater, we constantly need to be fed. And we feed off of the people we see every day.
Absolutely. Now, two kind of points here. In the interest of the last 5 minutes that we have, but also relating back to the topic you mentioned earlier about exposing yourself as an artist and really putting yourself out there, the Black Lives Matter mural that you did, that's actually set to be viewed within the next couple of weeks, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I know myself and some of us, a few other people were organizing. We're still actually getting it together. We were
Of course.
supposed to do an official unveiling, but it's kind of just gotten delayed with some permits. We got to get together to do that. We'll have like a little vending area, maybe some food trucks out there, some people will come out and give some spoken word or small performance, something just nice for one day thing going on. Kind of keeping it low key right now until we get everything together with the details, but we're hoping to plan something like that very soon. It was supposed to be right after the mural, but didn't happen that way because of a couple technicalities and details. But
of course.
That's the plan. So we'll
but it is happening. It is happening.
It is happening.
Right? It is happening. May not be happening this week, possibly not next week, but it is definitely going to happen. And it's just, I want to make sure that we spend a little time on that, because I'll definitely post if there's any sort of flyer or promotional material just to make sure that people know that it's happening. But also because Jersey City is the city that bred me as an artist. It's the city that I spent both my childhood and a portion of my adult life in. So it's amazing to me to see that this piece is there, and it's really important for me to express the importance of that city for me as an artist. Because, again, as an artist of color and a person who kind of sees things based on my own set of personal experiences that do involve culture, that do involve race and religion and, again, personal experience, it's important that something like this, Black Lives Matter, being posted massively on the streets, is there. Because for other artists who, the kids that are running up and down that street, for the people that are driving past that street or on that street, they're going to see that and they're going to think to themselves, this is possible. This is possible. That same way that you were that kid and, initially you weren't really sure how the business of it would work out because your dad didn't really see it that way, but you did. To me, that's what that mural is. It's like, yeah, my vision matters, my perspective matters, my view matters. Like all of these elements that are so personal to me as a person of color matters. And so that's why I just want to make sure everybody knows that it's definitely going to happen. We don't have a date yet, but I will be posting and showcasing at what point it's going to happen.
Yeah,
so
hopefully it's going to happen pretty soon, within next couple of weeks or whatever. We're still trying to get it together, but it will happen. And on that note, yeah, I mean, even while we were in the process of doing it, everybody that drove by is kind of either had the fist in the air, blowing horns. I'd say 95% of the people liked it, but then you had a few people that came out with some, words you don't want to use right now, like, what are y'all doing? They hated it. But once again, it goes back to my real thing. Nobody could ignore it. And also on that note, currently I'm working on a piece that's going to go in front of the building where I'm director at Mary McLeod Bethune Life Center up in the Greenville area. And I'm working on a sculpture of Mary McLeod Bethune that I'm in the process of working on, and the reason I want to bring that up is, as you see a lot of, going back to the current movement and what's going on with all the statues being torn down, it's important not just to tear down, but to also build and replace with monuments of things that people that should be represented, that shows the diversity and of the founding fathers and founding mothers that spearheaded, and not just spearheaded the forming of the country, but actually made it a reality, made the Constitution a reality. And, and also just showing more women. I mean, growing up, we've seen how many statues you see of old white men, that's kind of the reality of it. And so whatever I can do to contribute to some of the diversity and showing more women and statues or monuments that portray icons and historians and people of history that have done great things, I'm glad to be able to contribute to that. So I'm working on that in the process now, kind of the project I'm going into. Yeah.
And I absolutely love that because, again, in in the vein of growth as a community, you know, we all have growth to do, but I'm just happy that we are also recognizing that even our Black women need to be recognized. And again, our Black LGBT need to be recognized.
Yes.
So we're down to our last 15 seconds. And if anybody has any more questions, I know some questions are popping up about the date. Let us know, DM us. But otherwise, 10 seconds left. Thank you very much, Alvin, for joining us today on Adrift. It's been fantastic.
It's been a pleasure.
Be well, sir. Be well.
You too. Goodbye.
Bye.